From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. And featured today, K-State's Ted Schroeder, Brian Coffey, and Glenn Tonzer. They'll discuss their just-released analysis of price discovery in the cattle markets. A study commissioned by the USDA. It looks at the impacts of formula marketing agreements as they've evolved over the past 2 decades as compared to the cash negotiated cattle trade. And they came up with a set of recommendations on improving the flow of price information to you producers and throughout the beef industry. Later on this week's Wildlife Management segment, K-State's Charlie Lee takes another look at coyote behavior, how that influences attempts to control coyote damage. All this and more here on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today here on the K-State Radio Network. Welcome once again, as we'll devote time today to information that's been pulled together by a trio of agricultural economists here at Kansas State University. It's getting at a persistent question in the beef cattle industry having to do with market price discovery. Joining us now are Glenn Tonzer, Ted Schroeder, and Brian Coffey. They co-authored this large overview of information that they pulled together, which will hopefully shed some light on beef markets, cattle markets, efficiency, effectiveness there, and price and value discovery within all of that. And Ted, we'll bring you in first. This is a long-standing point of discussion, that is the influences of price discovery in the cattle sector, right?
Indeed, Eric. I should kind of launch where this project itself started about a year and a half ago. You know, we were in the sort of the beginnings of the COVID pandemic and seeing a lot of anxiety in the industry, the supply chain constraints and considerations that were going on. And of course, markets were reacting very violently and even understanding and seeing what was happening as that played out. And we started having conversations with USDA about this project. And the Office of the Chief Economist are the sponsors of this project at USDA. And it was fairly clear to us that we really needed to put together a comprehensive go-to place to really outline everything we understood about the structural changes, especially that had been occurring in the fed cattle and beef sector, and especially how the market has adjusted and evolved over time in response to that, so that we could really better understand, I guess, and articulate some of the long-run industry drivers that were happening and try to keep those separate and not get those clouded together and mixed up with some of those short-run things that were happening in the supply chain due to COVID. Of course, we had the Holcomb plant fire and before that, and then, you know, more recently the cyber attack on JBS. And we were just having a lot of really resiliency concerns, you know, happening on that side of the aisle, while still an industry that has had really enormous structural change over the last 20 years or so, trying to respond to evolving customer and consumer demands.
There's so much going on here. Glenn, getting one's arms around all of that is not easy. So how was this approached in tangible terms?
Yeah, so, you know, the three of us collectively tackled it, and if I had to kind of summarize, there's kind of, you know, looking through history of USD data patterns, those kind of things are documented, and that's all tasked up among the three of us and so forth. You'll see that when you look in the full report. As well as that, there was a more recent assessment, you know, just kind of documenting the percentage of cattle that are sold via, you know, formula negotiated, how that's changed over time and the like. So that's a little bit of a tangible kind of how it was done. Those are different steps. But I'll add to this a little bit of the historical perspective, which further motivates it. I think we're in an era where it's easy to forget where we came from. And I'm talking like multiple decades when I say that, not just a couple weeks well before COVID. And an awful lot of what is in this, whether it's lit review oriented or historical data or the like, actually has multiple decades of legs to it. And it's important to remember where the industry was, you know, frankly, even before I was born is relevant in part of this. But, you know, the industry's evolved for a lot of reasons. There was a demand issue that, you know, Dr. Schroeder and his colleagues before I was here, right, studied decades before, that underpinned some of this. The number of entities that are operating in the packing sector is very different than it was 30, 40 years ago. The number of cows in the industry is very different and the like. Some of these changes were survival-oriented, right? You had to get more cost-efficient to survive those adjustments. Some of those were survival-oriented. You had to get systems in place that coordinated demand signals and the like. So Ted, Brian, and I did our best to summarize that. Historical data from USDA largely, and some anecdotes from the industry also throughout this report.
Well, then, just to put down more framework here so folks know what you were going after, Brian, there were 6 stated objectives to this, right?
That's right, Eric. We broke this up into a few things, and we wanted to start out with kind of reviewing where we were, summarizing some data that Glenn mentioned, and talking about economic rationale and why the breakdown in the industry of some of the marketing methods of live cattle and then marketing methods of boxed beef also are as the way they are. And then documenting existing research and how that has shaped and informed what we know about the industry. And then kind of projecting forward and talking about how things continue to change and how we see them changing in the future. So sort of building on the summary and then moving into what we think is coming next. And then kind of on the beef side and the live cattle side, thinking about how we might think about livestock mandatory reporting and public use of that data in a way that's beneficial for all industry stakeholders. So that was sort of the rough path that we followed through the report.
Well, getting at this, there's a lot to work with here, but let's start with the orientation of marketing agreements, the evolution of those in recent years. And Ted, grid pricing has sort of been a standard bearer within all of that, has it not?
It has, Eric. And, you can look at this in 2 different directions. Certainly the changing customer and consumer drove a lot of how our industry has evolved and sent signals through what they prefer and how they purchase items back down to the producer level ultimately. And in order to have an industry that could be more responsive to these evolving customer and consumer expectations, we designed and developed pricing mechanisms and value sending signals from retail really all the way back to the cow-calf ultimately. The major structural shift that we were seeing, of course, in the fed cattle side was the movement away from cash negotiated commodity trade to more value-based grid marketing and marketing agreement type of arrangements. Those were designed originally out of a goal of being more efficient and being able to move cattle more quickly and more timely. And they became, over time, more focused on also value propositions for the cattle and focusing on quality and ultimately facilitating taking that quality to the customer through branding, through product differentiation, through further product enhancing. All of this goes together. A commodity-based system does not match well with branding and differentiation. And so a huge motivation around the structural shift in fed cattle exchange of moving away from cash negotiated to formula and market agreements was driven by that desire of producers to have access to premiums and discounts that would better match with what customers want. The long-run response to that was we saw a market increase, dramatic increase in the quality of beef being produced in the U.S. And if you'd asked me 10 years ago if we could have over 80% of our cattle grading choice and higher by today, I would have said I didn't think it was likely. Well, guess what? It not only was likely, we surpassed that. And we did that because we sent signals and paid for that value through those kinds of marketing arrangements.
So that is a substantial nugget out of this work, Glenn, is it not?
No, it very much is, and I will add and kind of build upon what Ted was saying. The way he outlined that, which I 100% agree with, but he used the signal or the comment on the retail side. Several of our listeners know I usually describe all our beef goes to one of 3 places today. So domestic retail, so think through the grocery store for at-home consumption ultimately, domestic food service to eat at a restaurant, or it's exported. Why is that relevant? If you go back a few decades, that split, conceptually they were there, but the relative proportions of U.S. beef that was in them was very different. The role of exports certainly was much lower than it is today, and at least pre-COVID, food service grew a lot relative to retail. the ability to do that and align not just what retail customers of the industry are wanting, but food service customers as well as export is related here as well. So not all beef is equal is where I'm going with that. And it's not just the prime versus choice versus select component, which is relevant. That's a component of this. But even your customers that are in the food service versus retail versus export, they're also looking for different things that aren't served well, in my opinion, by traditional systems that don't have a grid component and the like.
And to hammer that point home further, you did cite an actual dollar figure, what this really means to the industry as of 2019, this increase in quality of beef product.
That's a great point, because the whole point of increasing the quality of beef and how much quality beef is out there is because there are people out there who want to pay for it. And so we were estimating that because of that higher quality beef, the premium that's added, the possible premium that's added to sellers of beef is about $700 million as of 2019.
So it makes a difference. That is clearly what comes out of this. You must note, though, when entering into marketing agreements, a certain amount of flexibility is sacrificed on the part of the parties engaged in those agreements. So that has to be at least accounted for some, doesn't it?
That's right. If you're selling live cattle and you want to be able to take advantage of perceived market movements week to week, then the negotiated market gives you that opportunity. With the alternative marketing agreement, or so-called formula pricing, you can better ensure that you'll be rewarded for things like relationships with your upstream feeder cattle supplier, investments in a different feeding regime, or investments in genetics, those kind of things. You can invest in that being more confident that you'll be rewarded for it later on. So there absolutely are risk and flexibility trade-offs with these choices.
We're talking with K-State agricultural economists Brian Coffey, Glenn Tonzer, and Ted Schroeder about their newly released results of a project looking at effective and efficient cattle and beef market alignment, as they stated it. More on that in a few moments. You're listening to Agriculture Today. Agriculture Today continues now, as we've set aside time on today's broadcast to share some of the key findings from a recent analysis conducted by our three guests from agricultural economics here at Kansas State University, looking at the cattle and beef markets and the evolution of market mechanisms that are in play in those markets and just how they're impacting efficiencies and effectiveness of the markets. Joining us, Ted Schroeder, Brian Coffey, and Glenn Tonzer. We spoke just before the break, Ted, about the marketing arrangements, and there are all manifestations of those out there, but they are a key part of the overall market structure. But what about the traditional, the cash negotiated trade? Did you review information on that side of it as well?
Yeah, we certainly did, Eric. The cash negotiated trade, go back about 15 years ago, was probably representing about half of our fed cattle trade. And that's basically been displaced. Today it's down around 23%, depending on the week. And in some regions of the country, certainly much lower than that. Really, Nebraska, Iowa, and to some extent Kansas are probably the leaders in still operating in the cash negotiated trade. Places like Texas and Colorado really not participating much in negotiated trade and relying a lot more on formula. The concerns, and we've seen it in the policy arenas, and I know you and Glenn and others have discussed this several times, around various proposals that suggest we should potentially limit the amount of marketing agreement types of arrangements and strive for more cash negotiated trade. And so it's certainly some we're sensitive to, we're aware of. We address it in the report a fair bit. There's a trade-off. And the trade-off is if you believe that the value propositions are important for the industry going forward, and they certainly have been important drivers of prosperity in the industry over the last 15 years of striving to meet longer range supply chain value propositions. The cash negotiated trade market is not well suited for that. We spent years as we developed and designed grid pricing systems to recognize that we do a poor job of evaluating quality. We don't reward it well on a cash negotiated trade basis. And further, it doesn't facilitate branding, product differentiation further down the line. It doesn't facilitate longer run agreements between a processor and an end user. Marketing agreements do, on the other hand. That's why they've become so popular. So that trade-off of a negotiated, transparent, if you will, cash price to provide information to the industry on day-to-day price levels, the trade-off that you have is that you don't have the quality signals there. So the real challenge that we see is how do you have both? How do you have a quality-based, value-based pricing signal system or value system that can also have some better transparency in the market, better information flowing in the market? We've got some ideas around that, but this one really was addressing, understanding those trade-offs, documenting those trade-offs, recognizing they're there, but especially being cognizant of the fact that any way that someone might want to go in and limit the kinds of progress we've made on value and on marketing agreements and their value, any limitations to those could be immensely costly to the industry and take it backwards in a hurry if we're not careful.
And Eric, if I may just piggy on that as well, the second thing that is common in the general policy discussion where there's implications from this is there's a lot of discussion about adding packing capacity. So additional plants, there's a whole mix of announcements been made. There's federal subsidies and interest in, making that easier for the industry to do that for reasons related to bottlenecks and the like that's, Ted noted in earlier comments. That's also relevant here because that term trade-offs, and again, economists talk about trade-offs all the time. Ted mapped out the quality incentives and mapping that and getting that aligned, right? Producing what the public wants is what that boils down to. Well, we also need to be cognizant that those costly unintended consequences aren't just on the quality of beef, but you also run the risk. I mean, this is Glenn speaking as an implication of this report. I won't assign that to my colleagues here. Is several of the new plants very likely are going to have a supply-side coordination and maybe some of them a niche market opportunity interest is why they're being opened. And those are harder to do in a spot negotiated market as well. That's documented in this report, part of why we've moved away from it. Fast forward to 2021, that remains relevant when we have a discussion about adding plants and how they might be able to successfully operate. One needs to be aware of those trade-offs as well.
Let's hop right to the recommendations that the three of you shared. One of them, Ted, was that any policy actions that come forth should distinguish between those short-term disruptions that you described earlier and the long-term positives to the industry that you cited as well.
Indeed, and it's along the lines of what Glenn already mentioned. We recognize COVID and the kind of constraints it posed on the industry, and labor constraints and capacity became a real consideration and concern in the industry. The ability to move our cattle through a constrained packing system was a big issue, and certainly it's something we need to keep aware of. But those were sort of what we call black swan type events, the COVID and, of course, the Holcomb fire and so forth. Those things occur. We can't predict them. We have to deal with them as they occur, and we have to manage through them, and we have to build systems that are going to be resilient as we can to those. That's a different question, though, than a long-run industry striving to match production systems and production protocols with customer and consumer demands. Those are still in place, and we want to make sure that if we consider various policy regimes, that we don't put at risk the progress that the industry has made over 20, 25 years in genetics, as Brian said, in making production management decisions and systems that will produce very high-quality cattle consistently. Special program cattle that have differentiated values that are incentivizing, additional systems to produce those cattle and ultimately merchandise that product. We've got to make sure that we don't put in place things that impede that, restrict that, or else we'll have a shrinking industry long run. That's the outcome.
But to that point that you were bringing up, and that is what can be done to enhance reporting of prices, data collection that goes into that reporting. You want to study that further, you say, but do you have any preconceived notions of what that might look like?
Well, the first place to start is recognize we've got 70+% of our cattle, fed cattle, going through what USDA labels as the formula trade category. the price range on the formula trade any given week is very large. And the reason is because that's a very heterogeneous bucket of cattle price information. Anything that's not sold on a cash negotiated trade, that's not a forward contract, and that's not a negotiated grid, goes into formula trade. Well, that includes everything from a commodity animal that's simply formula priced off of a cash price to a high-quality spec animal that has a specific export certification perhaps on it or some production protocol, to a branded product, to even a product that's a very breed-specific, unique animal. As a result, you get a very wide range. 70% of our cattle going through a pricing system that's then being reported with a weighted average that really is difficult to interpret because the price range around that average is so large. One of our first goals is to see if we can't use existing data under LMR, and LMR, by the way, mandatory price reporting, livestock mandatory reporting, is essential, I believe, in terms of providing information in this industry. But first, can we dissect a bit better with existing data what is under that umbrella of formula pricing so we can inform those who are engaged in it and those who aren't, what the pricing signals are actually in that major segment of the cattle trade. We also believe, and this is more going forward, that while we're on that theme, we probably need a little more information. There's probably, based on what we've seen, previous studies on what's being captured right now under LMR in the formula trade. Remember, that was designed 21 years ago when formula trade was a very small component. Today, it's the major component. And we believe there's some information that could be collected and reported in a more refined way that's currently not even collected. Things like an NHTC or a breed-specific kind of protocol, think Wagyu as an example. Those cattle are in that formula trade, and they're influencing the overall distribution of prices. And we think that sorting those out a little better and providing a better perception or idea of what the premiums and discounts are would not only be informative, but help those who want to see the incentive opportunities available.
Well, it's a considerable chunk of data, and it's taken an effort and then some to pull all of this together into a good, succinct overview of where the cattle markets stand and the factors driving those and how that price discovery might be aligned for the future of the industry and the good of the industry at that. So congratulations to the three of you for putting this together. Thanks for sharing some highlights from it with us today.
Thanks for having us on.
Indeed, our pleasure.
Agricultural economists Ted Schroeder, Glenn Tonzer, Brian Coffey with us, co-authors of this analysis, which was prepared for, again, the Office of the Chief Economist, U.S. Department of Agriculture. It's entitled Effective and Efficient Cattle and Beef Marketing Alignment. If you'd like to see the full write-up, you can find it now at agmanager.info. That's agmanager.info. We'll be back after this break. You're listening to Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today from Kansas State University. Eric Atkinson here. Well, in its weekly crop condition and harvest progress report for Kansas, the USDA shares this for the week ending this past Sunday. Our top soil moisture supplies, 1% surplus, 50% adequate, and 49% short to very short, while subsoil moisture is 1% surplus, 53% adequate, and 46% short to very short now. Winter wheat planted now, reaching 13%. That's near the average for the date. The condition of the corn crop in Kansas, 56% good to excellent, 25% fair, 19% poor to very poor. Corn dented now at 93%, and corn having reached maturity at 62%. The corn harvest in the state is 20% complete now. Soybean crop conditions, 61% good to excellent, 28% fair, 11% poor to very poor. Soybeans having set pods now 95%, and beans dropping leaves up to 36% now. And the grain sorghum crop in Kansas, 58% good to excellent, 29% fair, 11% poor to very poor, with sorghum turning color now at 89%, having reached maturity 37%, and the grain sorghum harvest is now 5% complete in the state, according to the USDA. As for a glance now at harvest progress for corn and soybeans nationally, we'll turn to the USDA's Stephanie Ho.
Another week of mostly open weather across major production areas of the Plains and Midwest continue to push crops toward maturity.
USDA meteorologist Brad Rippey says 93% of corn is dented compared to a 5-year average of 89%.
Meanwhile, corn maturity passing the halfway mark to reach 57% by September 19th. That is significantly ahead of the 5-year average of 47%, even ahead of last year's 56%.
The corn harvest also is ahead of schedule.
Corn condition, we don't expect much change this time of year, barring a significant weather event. And so we see nearly steady corn conditions for the week ending September 19th, 59% good to excellent. That's a 1-point increase from last week. No change in the very poor to poor ratings, steady at 15%.
The pace of development for soybeans is ahead of schedule.
On September 19th, over half, 58%, dropping leaves. 5-year average, 48%. We are ahead of last year's 56%. The soybean harvest, 6% complete by September 19th. This is our first look at that for the 2021 season. That is right on par with the average of 5%, 1 point ahead of last year.
He points to one reason overall soybean harvest progress is not ahead of schedule.
The soybeans generally harvested first in the south, where we have had more clouds, more rainfall, and slower development. As that harvest moves northward, we should see rapid acceleration.
There is little week-over-week change in the nation's soybean condition, with 58% good to excellent and 14% very poor to poor. This is Stephanie Ho for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
This being a Tuesday, we're around to time now for another feature for you dairy producers from the Animal Sciences and Industry Department here at K-State. Milk Lines with K-State Dairy Specialist Mike Brook. Mike?
Today I'd like to visit with our Kansas dairy farmers concerning just the volatility in our raw milk market. You know, it's been a tough 18 to 24 months here. And as I look back at the prices that we've received for Class 1 fluid milk, as I look at base prices, so we look back to June of 2020, that was a very low time for us in the milk market, about $11.42 a hundredweight then. In just 6 months, when we got to December of 2020, we were at $19.87 for Class 1 base price milk. So in just a 6-month period of time, we saw a 74% shift in the price that we were receiving, the Class 1 milk that we were selling. So how does that impact you on the farm? This tremendous volatility, along with everything else that was going on at the time and continues to go on, has created some really serious financial situations on many of our dairy farms. As we look at where we're at today in the fluid milk market, our Class 1 price for August here in the central order, the base price was $16.90. So we've, again, slid back down the hill a little bit deeper than $16.90 actually, and then now we're rebounding just a little bit. But still, the margin situation is very critical. So as we look forward, what do we need to think about to try to stabilize what you're seeing financially on your farm from day to day and month to month? As we look forward, we need to be thinking about how we can take out some of this volatility. We actually need to do it on two sides of the operation. We need to do it on the expense side, so when you think about feed being 50% of what you're purchasing, utilizing things like the corn market and the soybean market to take out some of that volatility is very important. Now, on the income side, we have to do something on the milk side as well. As you start to look at that, that's where it really gets complicated, because when we sell milk, raw milk off the farm, the price that we actually get is based partially on Class 1 and also on the other classes of milk. So as you think about that in marketing, the basis for Class 1 milk is in a different month than the basis for Class 3 and 4. That's why if you look for marketing groups to work with, it's easy to find somebody that will help you on the feed side or the corn and soybean side. But trying to find somebody that's actually going to help you on the milk side becomes very difficult. And one of the reasons for that is over the years it's been very difficult to predict the basis for milk, particularly when we're doing it in 2 different months. So, what can you do to help? I think that there are many groups out there that actually work well with dairy producers to try to protect both sides of the market. But understand that when you go in with one of these groups and start working with them, it's very complicated. You do have to attend the meetings. Most of these groups will meet at least once a month, sometimes twice a month. You have to be there, you have to be present, you have to be engaged if you're going to get the maximum value for this. Is it always going to work? No, but over time, on average, it will work in your favor. This is Mike Brook with K-State Research and Extension, encouraging our Kansas dairy farmers to consider what they might be able to do to take out the volatility that they experience in the milk market as well as the feed market.
All right, Mike, many thanks to you. Quick calendar reminder here, we're just a little over a week away from the 22nd Annual Beef Stocker Field Day here at K-State. Thursday, September the 30th at the Stocker Unit just outside of Manhattan. And you can find out all the details, if you're not aware of those, by going to ksubeef.org. This is Agriculture Today. We're back now on Agriculture Today. Across the way once again to talk wildlife management with us, former wildlife specialist with K-State Research and Extension, Charlie Lee. Charlie, an overview this week on coyote management. We've had many an occasion to discuss coyote damage control in our series here over the years, and it still remains a topical matter for tons of landowners out there.
Yes, coyote control has had a long and contentious history in Kansas as well as other western states. The present-day control strategies vary depending upon the state and the individual or entity conducting the management activity, but for the most part, it's a non-selective removal of coyotes in the vicinity of depredation. Most of the time, that depredation is of livestock, but it seems more and more frequently, particularly in the southeastern part of the United States, coyotes are being blamed for reducing white-tailed deer populations. We do know that they are a predator of fawns. That's not usually been a major concern of the work that I've done in Kansas, but it seems that there are people that are concerned with coyotes' impact on other native species of wildlife in the state. And we've spent most of the time using types of control that were non-lethal and trying to get folks to understand that not all coyotes are killers of domestic livestock. We know that many coyotes and many landowners never have problems with coyotes and their livestock operation, but some do. And that's why Kansas has had a successful program of helping private landowners deal with coyote depredation for many years.
That comes back to understanding the nature of the coyote, and a big part of that, you say, is their territorial nature.
Yes, coyotes exhibit true territorial behavior, which means that small social groups defend an established area, which is the territory, from other groups of coyotes. Those territories are arranged across the landscape. They usually are not contiguous. There's always some space in between those territories. And within those spaces, there's often transient individuals. But first, let's talk about those territorial coyotes. Mm-hmm. Those coyotes would be controlling a territory. They're often controlled by a breeding alpha pair, and then they also contain non-breeding offspring from previous years, as well as pups from the current year. That's kind of what you're dealing with in a territorial group of coyotes. And we seem to have good luck in controlling the alpha coyotes within those populations when there's depredation going on. And oftentimes it just takes controlling the alpha coyote, which could be either the male or the female or both of those, to stop the depredation on livestock. Now, once that occurs, it's easier to capture pups, but oftentimes the alpha coyote is one of the first ones because they're more aggressive. They're out there defending their territory, so they're susceptible to some of the capture techniques that we've used. And I think when we can get people to focus on capturing the alpha coyote, it can make coyote management more effective and perhaps socially acceptable, because just taking untargeted coyotes is starting to have some concern for other folks. Other states have stopped taking coyotes as a means of coyote management. The techniques that have been used are getting scrutinized each and every year. Trapping is not popular with some of the public, but alternative methods such as calling and shooting can be done selectively, and we can target control to alpha coyotes because, again, those are often the ones that are going to come in to a call more frequently. The non-lethal control that's been used has some application, but I think it's going to be very difficult to implement non-lethal type control measures in all situations. I think we're always going to have a need for targeted removal of coyotes. We've talked many times about the basis of wildlife damage management is to follow the principles of habitat modification first, exclusion next, with proper fencing, and then the last would be removal. But habitat management is very difficult for an animal like a coyote that may have a home range of 1 to 2 sections here in Kansas and larger than that in other areas. We also have those transient coyotes, those that have not yet established a territory that are in between. Usually those are not dominant enough to become livestock killers, but occasionally that occurs. And they just wait for one of the alphas in a nearby territory to pass or be taken out of a population so that they can move in and have a breeding partner.
It all comes back, though, to that basic premise, and that is target the control to achieve comprehensive management of coyote damage.
Yeah, I think that's very important for people to understand, that we're going to be selective at our coyote control and make sure that our management actions are more effective. And on a short time frame, wide-scale population control might be effective, but coyote populations are very resilient, and the population is going to quickly come back. But when you target a few individuals, you can take those individuals that have developed the desire for livestock out of the population and perhaps still have manageable coyotes in there that are doing their ecological role in controlling some of the other species that we have out there in our ecosystem.
Well, there's plenty of guiding information on coyote management out there, including the resources that K-State Research and Extension has put together and maintained for years upon years. Charlie certainly contributing greatly to all of that, and you can tap into it through your local extension office or online at the K-State Research and Extension website. Thanks for some of the key principles of dealing with coyote damage. Good reminders, Charlie. He's former K-State wildlife specialist Charlie Lee, finishing out this Tuesday edition. Thanks to you for tuning in, and to remind, please check into our podcast service where you can hear a replay of each of our broadcasts. And if you'd like, you can arrange for an automatic download of same to your mobile device each day. Find out more at agtoday.net. That's agtoday.net. Eric Atkinson here, welcoming you right back here tomorrow for another Agriculture Today over this, the K-State Radio Network.